The old house had been abandoned for 11 years, and it showed. Garrett Hale stood in the knee-high grass at the edge of the property line, with his arms folded across his chest, studying the sag in the front porch roof, and the way the fascia boards had gone black with the moisture rot. November had stripped the surrounding oaks bare, and the cold coming in off the ridge line behind the house pressed through his jacket like it had a grievance. Beside him, Duna sat without being told, her dark eyes tracing the same roofline, her tan chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. She was a German shepherd of 11 years herself, retired from 3 deployments and 2 years of border work, and she had the stillness of an animal that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. The house sat on 2.5 acres outside of Birch Falls, Minnesota, a town of 1,200 people, in a county where December came hard and stayed. A gravel driveway led from the rural highway to a detached garage with a collapsed roof. 2 birch trees flanked the porch steps, their bark white and papery in the gray November light. A painted mailbox still stood at the road, though the name on it had faded to a ghost of letters that Garrett couldn't quite read. He had not planned to be here. The demolition contract had come through a building contractor named Darrell Voss, who ran a small operation out of Birch Falls and needed a reliable hand for teardowns. Garrett had been doing this kind of work for 2 years, drifting from county to county across the upper Midwest, taking the jobs nobody wanted. Gut the interior, strip the siding, pull the subfloor, leave it ready for the excavator. He was good at it. He didn't need to talk much, and he didn't need to care about what a place had been before he arrived. Duna stood and walked 3 steps toward the house. Garrett watched her. She didn't pull or press. She simply moved, the way she moved when something deserved a second look. He had learned 11 years ago not to dismiss that. If this story has you wanting to stay to the very end, take a second right now to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. There is more ahead worth waiting for. He'd been told the property had been purchased by a land development company called Northspan Holdings. The county records showed a transfer of deed 42 days ago. His contact at Northspan was a man named Preston Dark, who communicated exclusively by email and had never answered a direct question in a direct sentence. Garrett had not asked many. The job was the job. Show up, pull it down, leave the lot clean. The woman at the county assessor's office, a quiet woman in her late 60s named Frances Rupp, had looked at his name on the contractor form and said something he hadn't expected. You know, someone named Evelyn Marsh is still living there. He told her that was not possible. The property had been sold. Frances Rupp had pressed her lips together and looked at him over her reading glasses, the way a person looks when they know more than they've decided to say. Maybe so, she said, but she's still there. Somebody ought to check. That had been this morning. Now it was past noon, and the November sky was the color of old pewter, and Duna was standing 4 feet from the porch steps, looking at the front door. Garrett unfolded his arms and followed his dog. The porch boards were gray and warped, and 2 of them shifted under his boots, with a groaning sound that told him the joists beneath had started to go soft. He moved carefully, distributing his weight, testing each step before committing. The front door was not locked. It wasn't even fully latched. A faded curtain shifted in the gap. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again and said, "Hello, my name is Garrett Hale. I'm not here to cause any trouble." He heard a sound then, thin and careful, from somewhere inside. Not quite a voice, something closer to a held breath deciding whether to become one. Duna sat down on the porch and faced the door. That was the only answer Garrett needed. He pushed it open. She was in the kitchen, standing beside the stove with a cast-iron skillet held in both hands, not raised in threat, but gripped the way people grip something when they're frightened, and it's the only solid thing nearby. She was 77 years old, though she looked older, and she was small in the way of a person who had lost weight steadily over a long period without intending to. Her hair was white and pulled back in a bun that had partly come loose. Her eyes were brown and direct and not foolish at all, even in fear. "I'm not leaving," she said. He said, "I'm not asking you to." Her name was Evelyn Marsh. She had lived in this house for 41 years. She had raised 3 children here, buried a husband here, and in the years since her children moved away, she had kept on, the way people do when they don't know any other way to be. Her property taxes had been paid through an escrow account her late husband had arranged, automatic payments out of a modest trust account. What she had not known, because no one had thought to tell her, and the language in the documents was the kind that requires a lawyer to parse, was that the trust account had been mismanaged by a man named Dennis Fowler, who ran a financial planning firm out of Duluth under the name Meridian Asset Group. Fowler had let the tax payments lapse. He had let them lapse for 3 years, and when the county had moved to seize the property for back taxes, Fowler had quietly arranged for Northspan Holdings, a company in which his brother held a 20% stake, to acquire the property at tax auction for $62,000. She had received a single certified letter. She had not understood it. She had no one to help her understand it. And then, 11 weeks ago, the locks on the detached garage had changed. And a month after that, she received a notice from a company called Northspan Holdings, saying she would need to vacate the premises by December 1st. Garrett learned all of this across a kitchen table, over 2 cups of coffee that Evelyn made with hands that shook only slightly, while Duna settled herself on the linoleum beside the old woman's chair and rested her nose on Evelyn's foot. Evelyn looked down at the dog once, and something in her face shifted, a fraction of the fear going out of it like a lamp turned down. "She always do that?" Evelyn asked. "Only with people she's decided to trust," Garrett said. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Dennis Fowler told me the account was healthy," she said finally. "He told me I didn't need to worry about the house. He told me I wouldn't ever have to worry about the house." She didn't say this with bitterness. She said it with the flat, factual grief of someone who has had enough time to understand what happened to them, but not enough time to fully accept it. Garrett looked out the kitchen window at the yard and the bare birch trees. He thought about the demolition contract in his truck and about Preston Dark's emails and about the county assessor's woman, Frances, and her pressed lips. "Tell me about the house," he said. "Tell me everything you want to tell me." She told him. The house had been built in 1954 by her late husband, Martin Marsh, and his father. They had used timber from a stand of white pine that had come down in a storm, milling it themselves at a neighbor's sawmill. Martin had been 19 years old when he framed the walls. He had married Evelyn when he was 22, and they had moved in while he was still finishing the interior trim. He had died of a stroke at 68, sitting in his chair by the window that overlooked the side yard. Evelyn had not moved the chair. The chair was still there when she finished talking. Garrett drove into Birch Falls that afternoon and found the county assessor's office closing up for the day. Frances was putting on her coat when he knocked on the frosted glass. She let him in. He told her what he'd found. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been watching this happen for 3 years, and I couldn't get anyone to listen to me." "Who have you tried?" She listed names. The county attorney's office, a legal aid organization in Duluth, a local newspaper reporter who had moved on to a bigger market, an advocacy group for elder financial abuse that had sent a form letter. Nobody wanted a story about a woman who didn't read her documents, Frances said. Not unkindly, just as a fact she had learned to live with. Garrett asked her what documents existed. She told him about the tax auction records, the deed transfer, the certified mail log showing the single letter sent to Evelyn. She told him there were fiduciary records that should exist somewhere, that Fowler's management of the trust should have been subject to state reporting requirements, that if the reports had been falsified, there was a paper trail, but accessing it would require a formal complaint to the Minnesota Department of Commerce, and that complaint would require Evelyn to have legal representation, and that legal representation cost money Evelyn did not have. She has 2 weeks, Garrett said. December 1st was 17 days away. Frances looked at him for a moment. You demolish houses for a living, she said. Right now I do, he said. She held his gaze. Then maybe you need to start with a different kind of demolition. He drove back to the house in the dark and knocked on the door. Evelyn let him in without the skillet this time. He told her he was going to need a place to sleep while he worked on some things. She pointed at the narrow staircase and said there was a room at the top of the stairs with a good bed and a quilt her mother had made. He was not sure when he had agreed to any of this. He had not, precisely, agreed to anything. Duna was already at the foot of the stairs, and that was usually how it went. The room smelled of cedar and old paper. The quilt was blue and white, hand-stitched in a pattern Garrett couldn't name, but recognized as something that had taken a long time to make. He lay on the bed without taking off his boots for a long while, looking at the ceiling, thinking about the structure of what he'd heard and whether any of it was actionable in 17 days. In his experience, institutional predation operated like a well-designed building. It was stable because the load was distributed. One person's negligence, another person's opportunism, a third person's inaction, all of it spread across a structure that looked from the outside like the ordinary operation of legitimate systems. Taking it apart required finding the weak joint, the board that wasn't carrying its share, the one thing that had been done wrong in a way that couldn't be papered over. He thought about that for a long time. He lay still and listened to the house settle around him. Old houses had their own sounds, distinct from new construction, a lower register of creaks and shifts that came from timber that had dried and moved through decades of Minnesota winters. The walls in this room were plaster over lath, not drywall, and the plaster had a faint yellowing at the corners that told him the moisture had gotten in at some point and been managed before it could do real damage. Martin Marsh had managed it. The man had been dead for 9 years, and he was still, in the specific physics of a well-built house, managing things. Garrett thought about what it meant to build something with the intention of it lasting past you. He had spent 2 years in the business of endings, arriving at the tail end of a building's life and doing the necessary work of taking it apart. There was nothing wrong with that work. Sometimes a structure was genuinely finished. Sometimes the materials could be salvaged and the land could become something new. He had done it without regret. Still, lying in Martin Marsh's room under Martin Marsh's wife's mother's quilt, he found himself thinking about the difference between a building that had reached the end of its natural life and one that was being ended ahead of its time by someone else's calculation. That distinction felt important. He held it in his mind until he fell asleep. The next morning was cold and bright. The first real sun Birch Falls had seen in a week, and it came in hard off the snow that had fallen overnight. Garrett was on the porch before Evelyn was awake, his coffee in hand. watching Duna move through the side yard with her nose working the frozen grass. He'd been turning the trust account question over in his mind. The lapse in tax payments was a symptom. The disease was Fowler's management of the account, and the specific question was whether Fowler had filed accurate reports with the state. If he had filed accurate reports, the lapse might look like negligence, hard to prosecute and easy to explain away. If he had filed false reports, the money had to have gone somewhere, and that somewhere was the trail. Duna stopped. She was in the side yard, about 15 feet from the house's foundation, near the northwest corner where the porch wrapped around. She was standing still with her nose pointed down at the lattice, skirting along the base of the porch. Her ears were fully forward, not alarmed, curious with intent. Garrett set down his coffee and walked toward her. The lattice skirting was old, and some of it had warped away from its frame. There was a gap about 8 inches wide near the corner, and the gap went dark. Duna looked at him once and then looked back at the gap. He got down on one knee and looked in. There was a wooden crate under there, old, sitting on concrete blocks to keep it off the ground. He could see the corner of it in the light that came through the gap. He went to his truck for a flashlight and came back. In the beam, the crate resolved into a cedar chest about the size of a small trunk, padlocked with a heavy brass lock. The concrete blocks had kept it clear of the frost heave and the moisture that had damaged the lattice above it. He did not touch it. He stood there for a while, looking at the crate in the flashlight beam, thinking. The concrete blocks were old, poured in place, not purchased preformed, which put them at 40 years old at minimum. Someone had gone to the specific trouble of raising the chest off the bare ground, had thought about moisture and frost heave and the long patience of decay. The padlock was heavy brass, not a cheap combination lock, and the hasp it ran through was screwed into the cedar with bronze screws rather than steel, because someone had understood that steel screws rusted in damp environments and bronze did not. This had been put here to last. He went inside and made breakfast, and when Evelyn came downstairs in her housecoat and slippers, he asked her if she knew anything about a cedar chest under the northwest corner of the porch. She stopped moving. "Martin put that there," she said slowly. "He put it there the spring before he died. He said it was the house papers, the mortgage satisfaction, the deed, the original survey, the receipts from when he milled the timber. He said he wanted them somewhere dry." She looked at the window and then back at Garrett. "I forgot it was there. I forgot it completely." Garrett drove into town and found a locksmith named Archie Brandt, who ran his operation out of a converted service bay behind the hardware store. Archie was 58 years old, built like a man who had been lifting things since childhood, with thick gray laced hair and hands that were permanently stained with machine oil. He listened to the situation with the kind of attention that told Garrett he had already heard something about an old woman and a demolition order, because in a town of 1,200 people, information moved faster than it needed to. "I'll come out," Archie said. He didn't ask for a fee. They opened the chest that afternoon. Archie worked the padlock in 40 seconds with a pick he pulled from his shirt pocket, and Garrett lifted the lid, and the cedar smell came up clean and sharp in the cold air under the porch. Inside were documents in sealed waterproof envelopes, each one labeled in Martin Marsh's careful block printing. Mortgage satisfaction, dated 1989. Original deed, dated 1954. Survey plat, timber receipts, a homeowner's insurance policy renewed annually through 2009. And at the bottom, in a larger envelope labeled Trust, a set of documents Garrett recognized at once. The trust agreement. The original fiduciary appointment of Fowler, dated 12 years ago. A set of annual account statements, the last of which was dated 6 years ago, showing a balance of $41,000 in tax payments current through that year, and a handwritten note from Martin Marsh, tucked into the fold of the trust agreement, in the same block printing as the labels on the envelopes. Garrett handed the note to Evelyn. She read it standing in the cold yard with her coat pulled around her. When she finished, she pressed the paper against her sternum with both hands and looked at the sky for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He knew someone might try to take it. He wrote down Fowler's obligations. He wrote down what Fowler was supposed to do every year." Martin Marsh had not been a lawyer, but he had been a careful man, and his note listed, in plain language, the annual reporting obligations he had understood Fowler to have taken on. Report to the state annually. Maintain a full account ledger available to the beneficiary on request. Submit tax payments no later than March 15th of each year. Garrett asked Evelyn if she had ever received an annual report from Fowler. "He called me every Christmas," she said. "He said everything was fine. Did he ever send you paperwork?" She thought for a long moment. "Once. A long time ago. I signed something and sent it back." "Do you remember what it said?" She shook her head. "It was a long form. He told me it was just a routine renewal." Garrett looked at the account statement dated 6 years ago. He looked at the trust agreement. He looked at the note from Martin Marsh. He thought about the $41,000 that had existed in that account 6 years ago and where it might have gone. That evening he called Frances from his phone at the kitchen table, while Evelyn listened from her chair by the window. He described the chest and its contents. He described the trust document and the note. Frances was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Garrett, the state requires registered fiduciaries to file biennial reports with the Department of Commerce. If Fowler stopped filing reports or stopped maintaining the account after the last statement, there should be a gap in the state record. How quickly can someone request those records? With a formal complaint attached? 30 days, sometimes faster, if there's an active fraud flag." She paused. "But I know a woman at the department. Her name is Loretta Banks. She started in the enforcement division." Another pause. "I could call her tonight." Garrett told her that would be appreciated. The next morning, Frances called back before 8. Loretta Banks had been more than interested. The name Fowler had come up before, in a complaint filed by a family in Aitkin County 2 years ago that had not gained enough traction to become an investigation. A second complaint, from a separate source with documentation, would be enough to open a formal inquiry. Loretta Banks wanted copies of everything in the cedar chest. Garrett drove to the library in town that afternoon, where a woman named Gail Person ran the front desk, and also, it turned out, the only working flatbed scanner in Birch Falls County. The library was a squat brick building from the 1960s with a long oak circulation desk and shelves that reached to the ceiling and a smell of old paper and floor wax that Garrett associated with every public library he had ever been in. Gail was 61, sharp-eyed and matter-of-fact, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the quick, efficient movements of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had long since stopped caring. She scanned every document in 90 minutes while Garrett watched and Duna lay under the table between the reference stacks. "You're the fellow they brought in to tear this house down," Gail said, not looking up from the scanner. "That's right," Garrett said. "And now you're trying to keep it standing." "Trying," he said. She looked up at him over her glasses. "Good," she said, and went back to scanning. He sent the files to Frances that evening, and Frances forwarded them to Loretta Banks in Duluth. The Department of Commerce opened a formal inquiry into Meridian Asset Group the following morning. Garrett knew this because Frances called to tell him, and he could hear something in her voice he hadn't heard before, a kind of controlled relief, like a pressure that had been building for a long time, finally finding a release. An inquiry, though, was not a reversal of the deed. Northspan Holdings still held title to the property, and December 1st was now 11 days away. He needed a different angle. He found it through Archie Brandt, who happened to know that the original deed transfer from the tax auction had been handled by a title company in Two Harbors whose owner, a retired attorney named Howard Keefe, had a well-known discomfort with transactions that smelled wrong. Howard Keefe was 64 years old, with the broad, measured patience of a man who had spent 30 years reading the fine print so that other people didn't have to. He agreed to meet Garrett at his office on a Thursday morning. Garrett laid out what he had. The trust documents, the account statements showing a balance that had simply ceased to exist after a certain date, with no recorded transactions explaining the disappearance, the gap in state filings, the tax auction records showing Northspan's acquisition price of $62,000 for a property that, by any reasonable assessment, was worth considerably more. Howard listened with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes moving through the documents carefully. When Garrett finished, the older man was quiet for a while. "The auction itself may have been procedurally valid," he said finally. "That's the hard part. The county followed its process. What about Northspan's knowledge of the circumstances?" Howard looked at him. "If it can be shown that Northspan had prior knowledge of Fowler's connection to the property and the conditions that created the tax delinquency, their acquisition of the property starts to look less like an arm's-length transaction and more like a coordinated taking. Fowler's brother holds a stake in Northspan. That's a material relationship. Can that relationship be used to unwind the sale? It's grounds for a quiet title action," Keefe said carefully. "I'm not saying it wins. I'm saying it's a viable legal argument. And if the Department of Commerce inquiry turns up evidence of wire fraud, the whole transaction could be subject to a federal hold." He looked at the documents again for a moment. "I know a retired judge in this county who volunteers with a legal aid clinic in Duluth on Fridays," he said. "Her name is Patricia Wolfe. She'd want to see these." Garrett was beginning to understand that in a small county, every person who mattered knew at least two other people who mattered, and that the network of quietly outraged, competent people was larger than it appeared from the outside. Patricia Wolfe was 66 years old, silver-haired and composed in the way of a person whose composure had been tested by decades of other people's worst days. She met Garrett and Evelyn at the legal aid clinic on a Friday afternoon. She read through the documents in the same careful silence Howard had used. She asked Evelyn several questions, each one precise and without flourish, and Evelyn answered them directly. At the end, Patricia said to Evelyn, "I'm going to take this case, and I'm going to take it pro bono. And I want you to understand that the road ahead may take longer than December 1st. Evelyn nodded. "I understand," she said. "That means we may need to pursue a temporary restraining order to halt any demolition or transfer activity while the legal proceedings develop. Can you do that?" Garrett asked. Patricia looked at him with a slight lift of one brow. "Yes," she said. She filed the motion that afternoon. The application for a temporary restraining order cited the ongoing Department of Commerce inquiry, the documented relationship between Fowler and Northspan Holdings, and the potential fraud in the fiduciary management of the trust that had created the tax delinquency. The motion also cited a provision of Minnesota property law pertaining to conveyances made under circumstances of financial elder abuse. The order was granted on a Monday morning. Northspan Holdings could not proceed with any demolition or property transfer activities pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. Dark sent Garrett a terse email that same afternoon, informing him that his contract was terminated. Garrett read the email and put his phone away, and went to the kitchen where Evelyn was making soup. He told her about the order. She turned from the stove and looked at him for a moment, and something crossed her face that was not yet relief. Not yet, but was something adjacent to it. A cautious unwinding of a tension she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was separate from herself. "Sit down," she said. "Soup's almost ready." He sat. Duna lay down under the kitchen table and exhaled slowly. The Department of Commerce inquiry moved faster than Francis had expected. Loretta Banks and her colleagues had, it turned out, been waiting for exactly this kind of document anchor, because the Aitkin County complaint had opened a thread they couldn't yet follow to its source. Fowler's records, subpoenaed 3 weeks into the inquiry, showed that the trust account had been liquidated gradually over a period of 4 years. The funds moved through a series of intermediary accounts and absorbed into Meridian Asset Group's operating expenses. The state annual reports had been falsified, showing a balance that no longer existed. There were 6 other clients with similar patterns. Fowler surrendered his fiduciary license on a Tuesday. Criminal charges followed 4 weeks later, filed by the State Attorney General's office in a case that named 12 separate victims across 4 counties. The quiet title action, meanwhile, was proceeding through the county court. Howard had agreed to assist Patricia informally, and the two of them worked through the holidays building the argument that Northspan's acquisition was tainted by the coordinated circumstances of its creation. The connection between Fowler and Northspan's shareholder wasn't difficult to establish once the financial records were in hand. Northspan's attorneys settled the action in February, returning title to the property to Evelyn in exchange for a release of claims. The settlement also required Northspan to pay a sum that would cover 3 years of deferred maintenance and the reconstruction of the collapsed garage roof. Garrett was there when Patricia delivered the paperwork. He was in the kitchen, as he had been for most of the past 2 months, drinking coffee and watching the winter ease its grip on the yard. The snow had been retreating for a week, leaving patches of muddy grass at the base of the birch trees. The birches themselves were beginning to show the faint, greenish blush that came before the first true leaves. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and read through the documents carefully. She did not read quickly. She read the way a person reads when the words have weight and they want to feel all of it. When she finished, she set the last page down and folded her hands on top of it. "It was Martin's house," she said. "He built every board of it." Patricia said quietly, "It's your house now. That's final." Evelyn looked at Garrett. "You weren't supposed to stay," she said. Not as a complaint, just as a fact she was observing. "No," he agreed. "What were you supposed to do?" He thought about it for a moment. "Tear it down," he said. She nodded slowly, as if that made a kind of sense that she was still working through. The thing about a house, Garrett thought, watching the light come in through the kitchen window and fall across the table, and the documents and the old woman's folded hands, was that it was never really just boards and joists. It was the specific gravity of a life spent in one place, accumulated slowly over decades, the way silt accumulates at the bottom of a river, not all at once, but layer by layer until the depth of it becomes something you couldn't imagine moving. Martin Marsh had milled his own timber. He had built his own walls. He had put his important papers in a cedar chest on concrete blocks under the porch, because he was a careful man who had understood that the things worth keeping needed to be protected in ways that outlasted the protection of memory. His dog had found it. That thought had a quality Garrett couldn't quite name and didn't try to. He simply held it. Archie came over that afternoon with 2 other men from town to look at the garage roof and estimate the reconstruction cost. He had not been asked to bring anyone. He had simply shown up with them, as if it were obvious that a job like this didn't belong to one person. The second man was Bud Severs, a retired contractor of 67 with a bad right knee and the kind of unhurried confidence that came from having built things correctly for 40 years. The third was a younger man named Clay Erickson, 29, who worked at the county road department and had grown up 3 miles from Evelyn's house and had known Martin Marsh by name. They walked the garage and measured the wall height and looked at the collapsed roof from every angle while Evelyn watched from the kitchen window. Then they came inside and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and ate Evelyn's oatmeal cookies and talked about lumber costs and load calculations with the easy, practical seriousness of people who knew how to build things and understood that knowing how was a form of generosity when someone needed it. Bud Severs had a notebook, and he wrote figures in it with a mechanical pencil, his handwriting small and exact. Before they left, he had begun talking about which lumber yard in the county had the best price on the beams they'd need. He used the word "we" without appearing to notice he'd done it. Garrett noticed. He had been thinking about the road for 2 months, thinking about the next job and the next county and the next house that needed pulling down. He'd been thinking about it the way he always thought about the road, as a kind of mild background noise, the same noise that had been playing in his head for years now, since the last deployment, since the separation, since the long, flat stretch of years in which he had learned to stay in motion because motion kept the other thing, the stillness and the weight of it, from catching up. He had been thinking about it. He had not been making plans. The honest answer, if he pressed himself for one, was that he had stopped being sure, somewhere around the 3rd week of January, that the road was still doing what it was supposed to do. When he'd first started drifting, 2 years after the separation, the movement had served a real purpose. It had kept the weight of accumulated stillness from settling on him. Each new town was a reset, a clean set of obligations, nothing carried forward. He had been genuinely lighter for it for a while. At some point, the lightness had stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like absence. He hadn't been able to locate exactly when that had happened, which told him something about how slowly it had come on. You didn't notice the temperature dropping a degree at a time. You just noticed, eventually, that you were cold. He thought about Francis, who had been watching something wrong happen for 3 years and had not been able to find the right piece to make it visible. He thought about Archie arriving uninvited with 2 other men. He thought about Gail Person at the library scanner, saying "good" the way someone says it when they mean something more than the word. He thought about Howard and Patricia and the quiet network of people in a county of 1,200 who cared about what happened to their neighbors and had simply been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to bring them something to work with. He was not sure he had done anything that could not have been done by someone else. He was sure the timing had mattered. Duna was in the side yard near the northwest corner of the porch, in the exact place she had stood that first morning. She was not pointing at anything now. She was simply there, her nose lifted toward the air coming down off the ridge, her ears easy, her tail moving in the slow, unbothered way it moved, when she was exactly where she thought she should be. Garrett watched her from the porch for a long time. Evelyn came to the door behind him. She stood there without speaking, looking at the dog in the yard, and then at the birch trees, and then at the patches of green that were beginning to push through the mud at the base of the porch steps. "The room upstairs has good light in the spring," she said. "Martin used it as a study." Garrett said nothing for a moment. "I'm not a great tenant," he said finally. I'm not asking for rent, she said. I'm asking for company. He thought about that. Duna turned and looked at him from the yard, one ear pivoted back in his direction, her dark eyes steady and waiting. He thought about the structure of it. 2 people and a dog in a house that had been worth saving. A town of 1,200 people, where the county assessor knew the library director, who knew the locksmith, who knew the retired attorney, who knew the retired judge. A network of quietly outraged, competent people who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to bring them a piece of evidence, solid enough to build on. The garage would need its roof rebuilt. The porch boards needed replacing, at least 4 of them, and the joist beneath them would need to be sistered. The fascia along the north face of the house was rotted through and would need new material. Spring was a good time to start on a porch. He was good with his hands. He looked at the yard for another moment, at the dog and the birch trees and the thin new green appearing in the mud. And then he said, I'd need to bring a few things in from the truck. Evelyn said, The door's open. He went down the porch steps and across the yard toward the truck, and Duna fell in beside him without being called, her shoulder easy against his leg, her pace matching his exactly, as it had for 11 years, across 3 deployments and 2,000 miles of road. He was not sure what you called a thing like this. He was not sure it needed a name. The birch trees moved in the wind coming down off the ridge. Somewhere back up the road, a crow called once and went quiet. The house stood where it had always stood, 2.5 acres outside of Birch Falls, Minnesota, in a county where spring came slow but came surely, the same as it always had. Garrett reached the truck and opened the tailgate and looked at the tools and the few boxes that constituted, at this point in his life, everything he had with him. He picked up the first box. He picked up the next one. There are places in this world where goodness gets pressed down for a long time, and the pressing is patient and institutional, and wears the language of ordinary commerce. And then something shifts, not dramatically, not all at once. Sometimes it is no more than a dog stopping in a frost-covered yard and pointing her nose at a corner of a porch where a careful man left the truth in a cedar chest on concrete blocks 30 years ago. The truth waited. It always waits. And when it finally comes into the light, the people who have been quietly outraged for years are already there, waiting alongside it, ready to do what they have always been ready to do. If this story found you tonight, then you know what it means to wait for something worth waiting for. May you always have people in your corner who know that goodness is worth the time it takes. May your homes stand, and the ones you love be kept safe, and may God bless you and hold your family close.